On the afternoon of the 6th of February, 1952, at Sagana Lodge in the foothills of Mount Kenya, a 30-year-old man in khaki walked into a room where his wife was resting and told her that her father was dead. The room was simple: white walls, wooden shutters, the residue of safari dust on surfaces that had been wiped clean that morning. Outside, the equatorial light was still bright. A cine camera sat on a side table, loaded with footage of elephants at a watering hole that the couple had filmed the previous afternoon. The woman was 25. She had been a princess when she woke that morning. She was a queen now. And the man standing in front of her, the man who had carried the news across the lodge because no one else could bear to do it, was in the same moment, and without yet understanding it, the person who had the most to lose from the words he had just spoken. The public version of what followed is well known. A young queen returned to Britain. A nation mourned. A coronation was planned. The private version is different, and it is harsher. Behind the pageantry and the photographs, behind the balcony waves and the golden coach, a struggle was already forming, not between enemies, but between two people who both believed they were protecting the same institution. A husband who wanted to modernize the monarchy, and a mother-in-law who intended to preserve it exactly as her dead husband had left it. This is the story of Prince Philip's first years as royal consort, and the woman who ensured that his name, his home, and his place in the dynasty were taken from him before the crown was barely on his wife's head. It played out over rooms, declarations, and silences, and it lasted the rest of their lives. But to understand how Philip ended up standing in that room, delivering the worst news of his wife's life, while the worst news of his own was still hours from becoming clear, you have to go back further than Kenya, further than the wedding, further than the war, further than a 13-year-old princess watching an 18-year-old naval cadet across a college courtyard and deciding, with a certainty that would never waver, that he was the one. You have to go back to the name itself, to what Windsor meant by 1952, what it had cost to build, and what it would cost to defend. Because this is not simply the story of a marriage tested by duty. It is the story of two incompatible visions of monarchy, so one rooted in survival, the other in adaptation, and the family that spent decades negotiating between them inside the rooms, the titles, and the silences of the most public household on earth. It is the story of a husband, a widow, a young queen caught between them, and a name that none of them could afford to lose. By the early 1950s, the House of Windsor was not merely a surname. It was a settlement, a political fact dressed in ermine and presented as tradition, though it was barely 35 years old. George V had proclaimed it in 1917 during the worst of the First World War, when anti-German sentiment in Britain made it dangerous for the royal family to carry its actual dynastic name, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, inherited through Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, and as unmistakably German as the Zeppelins dropping bombs on London. The change was practical, swift, and permanent. The family would be Windsor. The name was drawn from the castle, which was drawn from the landscape, which was drawn from something that felt, to the British public, as English as anything could feel. And that was the point. Windsor was not a genealogical description. It was a national reassurance. It said, whatever else is happening in Europe, whatever thrones are falling, whatever dynasties are being consumed by revolution, this family is English. This family belongs here. This family is yours. What followed over the next 3 decades cemented the name into something far more powerful than a royal decree. George V stabilized the monarchy through personal conservatism and a gift for appearing ordinary in an age of revolutionary upheaval. His stamp collection, his shooting weekends at Sandringham, his Christmas broadcast, the reassuring dullness of a king who seemed to want nothing more than to be left alone with his dogs and his pheasants. His son, Edward VIII, nearly destroyed everything, abdicating in 1936 for Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, in a constitutional crisis that exposed the monarchy's fragility with a brutality that no one inside the institution would ever forget. The abdication was not merely a scandal, it was a proof of concept. The wrong man with the wrong instincts could bring the entire settlement crashing down. The private damage went deeper than the constitutional crisis. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the Duchess of York, who had built a quiet, contented life with a husband who never expected to reign, found herself queen consort to a man visibly buckling under a burden that was never meant to be his. George VI's stammer, which had improved through years of speech therapy, worsened under the pressure of kingship. His health, never robust, began its long decline. The Duchess, now Queen Elizabeth, blamed Edward and Wallis Simpson for what had been done to her husband with a conviction that was not a passing emotion, but a permanent feature of her moral landscape, coloring every subsequent judgment she made about who belonged near the throne and who did not. That lesson lodged itself deep into the Windsor consciousness. It became the founding trauma of the modern monarchy, and it meant that anyone who arrived at the palace carrying a whiff of novelty, foreignness, or personal ambition would be measured, consciously or not, against the ghost of the uncle who had walked away. And then George VI rebuilt it. Albert Frederick Arthur. George, birdie to his family, a man who had never expected the throne and visibly struggled with its demands, married Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923 and found in her a partner whose social gifts compensated for his painful stammer and natural reserve. Together, they constructed a public image of decency, warmth, and domestic stability that was both genuine and strategically essential. When war came in 1939, they refused to leave London. Buckingham Palace was bombed 9 times during the Blitz. The King and Queen walked through the wreckage of the East End, visited factories, comforted the bereaved, and presented a monarchy that shared the suffering of its people rather than hiding from it. Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother, reportedly said after the palace was hit that she could now look the East End in the face. Whether she actually said it or whether the phrase was polished by repetition does not matter. What matters is that by the time the war ended, the Windsors had earned a moral authority that went far beyond title. They had earned it through endurance, and endurance had become the family's central value. Continuity, steadiness, the refusal to crack. That was what Windsor meant by 1952, and that is the fortress Philip was walking into. The financial dimension of this settlement was subtler than the symbolic one, but it shaped the atmosphere in which the post-war monarchy operated. Royal domestic life after 1945 sat inside a Britain still governed by austerity, rationing, restrictions on building materials, a national mood that was simultaneously proud and exhausted. The Crown's finances were tied to the civil list, parliamentary grants, and the revenues of estates like Sandringham and Balmoral, which were private rather than state property. The great country houses of the aristocracy were already beginning their long post-war decline under the pressure of death duties and maintenance costs, and although the royal family was insulated from the worst of that erosion, the atmosphere was one of restraint rather than extravagance. This matters because Philip's modernizing instincts, his desire to make royal life functional, efficient, less encrusted with pointless ritual, were being applied inside a household that could not easily spend its way to change. The arguments that would erupt after the accession were never simply about taste or temperament. They were about whether a monarchy operating under post-war austerity would invest its limited resources in preserving inherited forms or in adapting them. The key properties anchored the story in physical space. Buckingham Palace was the sovereign's official residence and working headquarters. Vast, formal, run by a household of courtiers whose hierarchies had calcified over generations. Clarence House, adjacent to St. James's Palace on the Mall, was the intimate, habitable London home where Elizabeth and Philip made their first married life and where their children were born. Sandringham in Norfolk was the private estate where the family gathered for Christmas and where George VI would die. Balmoral and the smaller Burke Hall in the Scottish Highlands held the pre-1952 memory of family continuity, summers shooting, the private rhythms of a family that was never truly private. Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park had been George VI and Elizabeth's weekend retreat, and Broadlands, the Mountbatten family seat in Hampshire, linked Philip to the patronage and ambition of his uncle Dickie. Each of these places would play a role in the territorial struggle that followed the accession, but one mattered more than the rest. Clarence House was where Philip had built something. It was where his children had been born, where his domestic vision had taken physical form. And it was the house that would be taken from him and given to the woman who represented everything he was fighting against. The value system that governed this world can be stated plainly. Continuity over novelty, Englishness over cosmopolitanism, duty over self-expression, and deference to the established court process over spousal instinct. Plant that early because it explains why the Queen Mother, Queen Mary, Churchill, Lascelles, and the broader palace machinery did not have to coordinate their opposition to Philip in any formal sense. They were already aligned by temperament, by training, and by the institutional memory of what had gone wrong with Edward VIII. Philip was not entering a conspiracy. He was entering a worldview, and the worldview had just survived both abdication and war. It believed the next task was preservation. Philip believed the next task was adaptation. Both sides believed they were defending the monarchy. That is what made the conflict so potent and so impossible to resolve cleanly. Now the people. Because the story of a dynasty is always, in the end, the story of the individuals caught inside it. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was born on the 10th of June, 1921, on the island of Corfu, the only son and fifth child of Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark and Princess Alice of Battenberg. The titles sound grand. The reality was exile. Philip was barely 18 months old when a military coup forced the Greek royal family from the country, and the infant prince was carried to safety, according to family legend, in an orange crate, aboard a Royal Navy cruiser, sent at the request of George V. His father, Prince Andrew, drifted into a restless, aimless expatriation on the French Riviera, settling eventually in Monte Carlo, increasingly absent and emotionally remote. His mother, Princess Alice, suffered a severe mental health crisis in the late 1920s. The diagnosis at the time was schizophrenia, and was committed to a sanatorium in Switzerland, where she remained for years. Philip, still a child, was effectively parentless. He was passed between relatives and guardians. His grandmother, the Dowager Marchioness of Milford Haven, in Kensington Palace. His uncle George, the second Marquess of Milford Haven, at Linden Manor in Berkshire. And increasingly his uncle Lord Louis Mountbatten, who became patron, mentor, strategist, and the closest thing Philip had to a consistent anchor. There is something about that childhood that is worth sitting with. The boy who would become the most visible consort in British history grew up without a settled home, without the sustained presence of either parent, and inside a web of European royal connections that were simultaneously illustrious and unstable. He was sent to Chim Preparatory School, then briefly to Salem in southern Germany. An uncomfortable episode, as the school's Jewish founder, Kurt Hahn, had already been forced to flee Nazi persecution. And then to Gordonstoun in Scotland, Hahn's new foundation, where the ethos was cold showers, physical endurance, community service, and the absolute suppression of self-pity. The school sat on the Moray Firth, exposed to North Sea winds, and governed by a philosophy that treated comfort as an enemy of character. Philip thrived. He became head boy, captain of cricket and hockey, a natural leader in a system that rewarded toughness and penalized vulnerability. He was good at everything that could be measured. What could not be measured? The loneliness, the unprocessed grief of a fractured family, the particular defensive edge of a boy who had learned that charm and competence were the only reliable currencies, was folded inward and kept there. He went from Gordonstoun to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth in 1939, and from Dartmouth into the war. His service was genuine and distinguished. He was mentioned in dispatches after the Battle of Cape Matapan in 1941, served on convoy escorts in the North Sea and the Indian Ocean, and was present in Tokyo Bay for the Japanese surrender in 1945. By the war's end, he was a lieutenant with a legitimate career, a man who had found in the Navy the structure, the hierarchy, and the sense of earned belonging that his childhood had denied him. He was also, beneath the confidence and the physical command, a man hypersensitive to exclusion. He had spent his life earning his place. The idea that he might be denied one, inside his own marriage, inside his own household, caught at something older and deeper than pride. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, the future Queen Mother, was born on the 4th of August, 1900, the ninth of 10 children of the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, raised between St. James's Square in London and Glamis Castle in Angus, a place so steeped in historical association it carried echoes of Macbeth. Her childhood was Edwardian in texture. Governesses, house parties, the ordered rhythms of the Scottish landed gentry. But the First World War gave it weight. Glamis was converted into a convalescent home for wounded soldiers, and the young Elizabeth, still a teenager, helped tend them, She learned that duty was not abstract. It had a physical form. It smelled of antiseptic and sounded like the muffled groans of men in pain. Her marriage to the Duke of York in 1923 was reportedly preceded by 2 refusals, which suggested that she entered royal life with her eyes open and her expectations clear. She had other suitors. She had options. The life she chose was not forced upon her, and that distinction mattered because it meant she inhabited the role of royal consort not as a prisoner, but as a believer. When the abdication forced her husband onto the throne, Elizabeth became the emotional engine of the monarchy's reconstruction. She was the warmth beside George VI's reserve, the public ease beside his private struggle, the visible courage during the Blitz when Buckingham Palace itself was struck, and she walked through rubble in her best clothes as though rubble were merely another kind of floor. She understood, instinctively and practically, that the monarchy survived on the appearance of unshakable calm. That understanding would define her widowhood as completely as it had defined her marriage. She was also, in ways that the public image of gentle warmth obscured, a woman of considerable political instinct and social steel. She cultivated relationships with courtiers, politicians, churchmen, and the wider aristocratic network with a skill that kept her at the center of things, without ever appearing to campaign for influence. Her entertainments at Royal Lodge and later at Clarence House were legendary, not in the vulgar sense of excess, but in the sense that an invitation to her table conferred a kind of social validation that few other figures in Britain could offer. She entered widowhood in 1952 not diminished but fortified. Her grief was genuine, so was her authority. She was not merely a grieving mother. She was the keeper of the dead king's legacy, and she intended to keep it. Sir Alan Lascelles, Tommy Lascelles, had served as private secretary to George VI and continued under the new queen. He was in the most precise sense the permanent government of the palace, the man who controlled access, shaped advice, managed the flow of constitutional business between the sovereign and her ministers. He was also profoundly conservative, suspicious of innovation, and quietly hostile to the Mountbatten orbit. He did not need to raise his voice. He governed through memoranda, scheduling, and the careful architecture of who spoke to the queen and when. His opposition to Philip was not personal hatred. It was institutional reflex. The court existed to protect the sovereign from disruption, and Philip, in Lascelles' assessment, was disruption given a title and a bedroom. Winston Churchill, who returned to the premiership in October 1951 and was therefore in Downing Street when the accession occurred, carried his own weight. Churchill was a romantic monarchist, attached to the crown with a sentimentality that was half genuine and half strategic. He saw the monarchy as the emotional keystone of national unity, and he had no patience for anything that threatened to unsettle it, least of all a dynastic name change that would erase the word Windsor from the institution's identity. His agreement that the house would remain Windsor gave Philip's defeat the authority of the state. It was no longer a family argument, it was government policy. Queen Mary, George V's widow, was 84 years old and frail by early 1952, but her influence was undiminished. When Lord Mountbatten was heard to boast that the House of Mountbatten now reigned, Mary's reaction was immediate, cold, and decisive. She reinforced the case for Windsor with every ounce of dynastic conviction she possessed. Her death in March 1953, just weeks before the coronation, removed the oldest guardian of the Windsor name from the stage, but by then the decision had already been sealed. Lord Louis Mountbatten, Dicky, was the shadow behind Philip that made the sunlight harder to see. He was brilliant, vain, ambitious, and possessed of a vision for the Mountbatten family's place at the center of British power that alarmed everyone who detected it. He had been Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia, the last Viceroy of India, and the man who had recovered the post of First Sea Lord that his father had been forced to surrender. He saw Philip's marriage as a restoration. The old guard saw it as an attempted coup. Both readings contained truth, and neither could be separated from the other. Princess Margaret, 21 years old when her father died, would move with her mother to Clarence House and become part of the alternative household that formed around the Queen Mother's widowhood. She mattered less as a combatant than as a presence. Volatile, glamorous, emotionally vivid in ways that contrasted with Elizabeth's controlled stillness, who deepened the Queen Mother's court into something more than a widow's retreat. It was a household, it had life, and it occupied the house that had been Philip's, and Princess Alice, Philip's mother. By the 1950s, she had re-emerged from her years of illness into a life of austere religious devotion, founding a nursing order of Greek Orthodox nuns in Athens. During the German occupation, she had sheltered Rachel Cohen and her two children in her own home, at documented personal risk. Yad Vashem would later recognize her as righteous among the nations. She mattered to this story because she complicated the easy anxiety that the palace felt about Philip's continental background. The family line the court distrusted was also the line that had produced a woman of extraordinary moral courage. Philip carried that inheritance. It bought him almost nothing inside the palace. But it was real. Elizabeth herself, Princess Elizabeth before February 1952, Queen Elizabeth II from the instant of her father's death, was born on the 21st of April, 1926, at 17 Bruton Street in Mayfair, and raised inside a close, loving household that the abdication crisis had transformed into a national symbol. Her childhood before 1936 had been sheltered and happy. A world of ponies, corgis, the nursery at 145 Piccadilly, a sister she adored, and parents who were present in a way that many aristocratic families of the era did not manage. The abdication changed everything. At 10 years old, she became heir presumptive, and from that point forward, every significant relationship in her life with her mother, her sister, her future husband, her children, her court, was shaped by the knowledge that she would one day be sovereign. She was trained accordingly. Constitutional history, with Sir Henry Martin, the Vice Provost of Eton, French with a succession of governesses, the deportment and manner expected of a future queen. At 18, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, learned to drive and maintain military vehicles, and became the first female member of the royal family to serve in the armed forces. It was a modest contribution in military terms, but it mattered symbolically, and it mattered to her. She had done something that was hers, something that connected her to the shared experience of her generation. She loved Philip with a constancy that never wavered. She also loved the institution she inherited, and the two loyalties would pull against each other in ways that defined her reign and, in the early years, her marriage. That tension was not something she would ever fully resolve. It was something she would manage them steadily, loyally, with a discipline that sometimes looked like passivity, but was in its own way a form of endurance as relentless as anything the Queen Mother had demonstrated during the war. The meeting at Dartmouth in July 1939 set the shape of everything. The Royal Naval College, a formal visit by the King, the Queen, and their two daughters, an 18-year-old cadet assigned to entertain the princesses while the adults toured the grounds. Philip was tall, blonde, athletic, and self-assured in the manner of someone who had learned to perform confidence as a survival skill. Elizabeth was 13. The accounts disagree on details: the tennis court, the croquet lawn, how much she showed off, and how little she disguised her fascination. But they agree on the outcome. She decided. The letters began. They continued through the war, through the years of separation, through the slow transformation of girlish attachment into adult commitment. By the summer of 1946, when Philip proposed at Balmoral, Elizabeth's answer was not a decision. It was a confirmation. George VI insisted on delay. He loved his daughter, and he was protective, perhaps more protective than he realized. He understood what the marriage would cost her. Not in money, but in privacy, in autonomy, in the ability to build a life that belonged even partly to herself. He also understood, without needing it spelled out, that Philip's background carried complications that the court and the press would not ignore. There were whispers about Philip's sisters, all four of whom had married German princes, some with connections to the Nazi Party. There were questions about his rootlessness, his lack of independent means, his Mountbatten associations. The engagement was not announced until July 1947, and even then the palace managed the optics carefully. Philip had already renounced his Greek and Danish titles, become a naturalized British subject, adopted the surname Mountbatten, and been created Duke of Edinburgh, Earl of Merioneth, and Baron Greenwich. He arrived at the altar at Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November, having shed every external identity he possessed except the one the British state was willing to give him. 2,000 guests attended the ceremony. The bride wore a dress by Norman Hartnell, decorated with 10,000 seed pearls. Post-war Britain consumed the wedding as a balm, something beautiful amid austerity, something to celebrate after years of loss and gray. Philip understood the public mood. He also understood, in a way he could not yet fully articulate, that the surrenders were just beginning. He had given up his nationality, his family's titles, his sister's ability to attend his wedding. None of them were invited because the proximity to wartime Germany was judged too sensitive. And his name. What he had received in return was a title, a uniform, and a wife who loved him. Whether that would be enough depended on a question that nobody in November 1947 was yet asking. What would happen when the wife became queen? Clarence House became their home, and for a few years it was a genuinely happy one. The house on the Mall, adjacent to St. James's Palace, had been built in the 1820s by John Nash for the Duke of Clarence, the future William IV, and had served various royal residents since. But when Elizabeth and Philip moved in after their wedding, it was in poor condition. The plumbing was Victorian, the wiring inadequate, and the heating barely functional. Post-war restrictions on labor and materials meant that the renovation was modest by royal standards, but Philip threw himself into the project with the practical energy of a man who had spent years making naval vessels work under difficult conditions. He oversaw the modernization of wiring, heating, and plumbing. He arranged furniture with an eye for function rather than formality. Many of the furnishings came from their wedding gifts. A refrigerator here, a set of china there, the accumulated generosity of a nation that wanted the young couple to have a good start. The result was a residence that bore Philip's stamp more clearly than any royal property would again. It was clean-lined, efficient, and livable. It was not a museum. It was not a monument to precedent. It was a home, and it was the first tangible proof that Philip's vision of royal life, practical, modernized, stripped of unnecessary ceremony, could produce something that actually worked. Charles was born there on the 14th of November, 1948, in a room that Philip had helped redesign. Anne followed on the 15th of August, 1950. A nursery was established on the upper floors, staffed by nannies but visited constantly. Philip played with his children in the gardens. Elizabeth bathed them before bed when she could. Visitors to Clarence House in those years reported an atmosphere of surprising informality, laughter in the corridors, toys on the stairs, a young family doing what young families do behind walls that happen to belong to the crown. A domestic rhythm took shape, never ordinary, but closer to ordinary than anything that would follow. And that is what makes what came next so painful. Because Clarence House was not just a house Philip had renovated. It was the physical proof that his idea of family life, his idea of monarchy could exist. When it was taken from him, it was not just an address that changed hands. It was an argument that was lost. Philip was still serving in the Royal Navy during this period, posted to Malta for stretches between 1949 and 1951, first as first lieutenant aboard HMS Checkers, and later in command of HMS Magpie, a frigate. Elizabeth joined him there whenever royal duties permitted, staying at the Villa Guardamangia, the rented home of Philip's uncle Dickie and his wife Edwina. Those months were remembered by both of them and by those around them as the happiest of their marriage. Elizabeth attended polo matches at the Marsa Sports Club, went swimming in the warm, shallow bays of the island, danced at the Hotel Phoenicia, had her hair done at a local salon, and lived for the only sustained period of her life, something approximating the existence of a naval officer's wife. She could walk through Valletta without a police escort. She could sit in the stands at a regatta and cheer without a program of events dictating when she smiled. Philip had command, purpose, a ship that answered to him, and a wife who was visibly uncomplicatedly happy. The sun, the sea, the limestone, the informality, the blessed distance from London. It was a life that worked. It was the life Philip had imagined marriage could be. But even in Malta, the future was pressing in. Elizabeth's visits grew shorter as her father's health declined. Philip was called back for royal duties more frequently. The idyll had a clock on it, and the clock was running down. George VI was dying. The lung cancer diagnosis came in 1951, and though the full truth was managed and softened, the trajectory was unmistakable. Elizabeth was pulled back into royal duties. Philip left active naval service, reluctantly, permanently, and with a sense of loss that biographers would note for decades. The couple returned to Clarence House. The private world contracted. And in late January 1952, they departed on a Commonwealth tour on behalf of the king, because the king could no longer travel. They flew first to Kenya. They visited Sagana Lodge and the treetops viewing platform. They were young. They were together. They were also, though neither said it, performing a duty borrowed from a man whose death was approaching with a certainty that the family acknowledged in logistics, but not yet in words. They left Britain as a princess and her husband, with two small children at home and a father whose illness everyone understood in the way families understand such things. Obliquely, through adjustments and silences and the careful management of what is said aloud. The next time they returned, one of them would be sovereign, one of them would be consort, and the woman waiting in London, grieving, formidable, and more powerful in widowhood than anyone yet realized, would begin the quiet, relentless work of ensuring that the monarchy her husband had rebuilt would not be remade in anyone else's image. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. They arrived in Kenya on the 1st of February 1952. The tour had the texture of borrowed duty, a Commonwealth itinerary assembled for a king who could not travel, handed to a princess and her husband because someone had to go, and because going was what Windsor's did. The official schedule included receptions, inspections, and the diplomatic choreography of a princess representing the crown in a colony that was already beginning to stir with the pressures that would, within a decade, produce independence. But Kenya, at least in the opening days, carried a lightness that the couple had not felt in months. The weather was warm. The landscape was vast and vivid in a way that made the gray corridors of London feel like a memory from another life. And for a few days, the machinery of monarchy loosened its grip just enough to let Elizabeth and Philip feel like a young married couple on an adventure rather than instruments of state. They stayed at Sagana Lodge, a wedding gift from the Kenyan government, a low white bungalow set in the green foothills of Mount Kenya, surrounded by tropical gardens and crossed by a trout stream that Philip took to immediately. He fished. Elizabeth watched him fish. They filmed wildlife with a Sony camera, the kind of amateur footage that royal couples accumulated on tours and that would later surface in documentaries as evidence of private happiness. Slightly overexposed, charmingly unpolished. The two of them laughing at something the microphone did not catch. On the 5th of February, they drove to the Treetops Observation Lodge in the Aberdare Forest, a modest wooden structure built into the canopy of a giant fig tree overlooking a watering hole. They spent hours there, watching elephants, rhinoceros, and warthogs come and go in the afternoon heat. Philip with his binoculars, Elizabeth delighted by the unhurried spectacle of animals behaving as though they were not being observed. It was the kind of afternoon that stays in memory precisely because it carries no weight, no ceremony, no obligation, no performance. Just two people watching wild things move through a landscape older than any dynasty. By the time they returned to Sagana Lodge that evening, George VI was already dead. He had died peacefully in his sleep at Sandringham House in the early hours of the 6th of February, his body found by a valet who had come to draw the curtains. He was 56 years old. The lung cancer that had been diagnosed the previous autumn and the surgery that had removed his left lung in September had not saved him. His heart had given out in the night, and with it the reign that had held the monarchy together through abdication, war, austerity, and the slow, exhausting work of being a king who had never wanted the crown. The news took hours to reach Kenya, a chain of coded telegrams, scrambled telephone calls, and increasingly frantic messages relayed through Government House in Nairobi and the tour's communication staff. Philip's equerry, Mike Parker, heard first, picking up a report on the radio and then receiving confirmation by telephone. It fell to Parker to tell Philip, and it fell to Philip to walk into the room where his wife was resting and tell her that her father was dead, that she was queen, and that the life they had been living The life of the trout stream and the Cine camera and the elephants at the watering hole was finished. What happened in that room belongs to the hook of this story, and the viewer has already been there. What matters here is what happened in the hours that followed. The speed with which the private world of a marriage was swallowed by the constitutional machinery of succession. Within minutes of Elizabeth being told the tour was cancelled, within hours suitcases were being packed, cars arranged, the Sagana Lodge staff standing in uncertain silence as the couple who had arrived as guests departed as sovereign and consort. Elizabeth changed into the black mourning clothes that had been packed, as protocol invariably demanded, for exactly this contingency. The palace never sent a member of the royal family abroad without mourning attire, because the possibility of a king's death was always, in the logistical calculations of the household, a live scenario to be prepared for. The black dress, the black coat, the black hat, they were ready. The fact that they were ready said everything about the world Elizabeth had inherited. A world that planned for grief the way other households planned for weather. Philip, by every account, was subdued, practical, and already receding into the supporting role that the moment required of him. Mike Parker would later recall that Philip looked as though the world had collapsed around him. He was not wrong. The world that Philip had known, a world in which he was the central figure in his wife's domestic life, the man with the plan, the officer in command of the household, was over. It ended not with an argument or a decree, but with a death in Norfolk. And from that death forward, everything Philip had built or hoped to build would have to be renegotiated under terms he did not set. The flight home on the 7th of February landed at London Airport in the late afternoon, under a sky that was low and gray and English in the way that makes returning from anywhere warmer feel like a sentence being handed down. Elizabeth descended the aircraft steps in black, a coat, a hat, a face, composed into the mask of controlled grief that she would wear, with variations for the rest of her public life. She was 25 years old. She had been queen for approximately 36 hours. On the tarmac below, lined up in dark coats and somber faces, stood the machinery of state. Winston Churchill, 77 and visibly moved, Anthony Eden, the foreign secretary, Clement Attlee, the leader of the opposition, Lord Woolton, the Lord President of the Council. They stood in a row like men at a funeral, which in a sense they were attending, the funeral of one reign and the birth of another, compressed into the walk from an aircraft door to a waiting car. Philip walked behind her. He would spend a great deal of the next 50 years walking behind her, and the geometry of that position, close enough to be present, far enough back to be subordinate, was established here, on a runway, in the failing light of a February afternoon that smelled of engine fuel and wet tarmac. There were no crowds. The arrival was private, or as private as the accession of a monarch could be. Elizabeth was driven to Clarence House, where she would stay briefly before the move to Buckingham Palace, and where the first of the many decisions that would define her reign was already waiting. The first question was not grief, it was identity. Martin Charteris, Elizabeth's private secretary, had asked it while they were still in Kenya, in the scramble of the accession's first hours. What name would she reign under? Elizabeth's answer was quick and on the surface unremarkable. Her own name, of course. Elizabeth. What else would she call herself? But the simplicity of the answer masked the complexity of the question it had opened, because a queen's name is not merely personal, it is dynastic. It carries the house, the line, the legal identity of succession. The name Elizabeth was settled. The name of the house was not. And the question of which house now reigned, Windsor or Mountbatten, was already forming in the space between official condolences and private conversations, in the studies and drawing rooms of the people who understood that the death of one king and the accession of a married queen had created a constitutional ambiguity that someone would have to resolve. Lord Mountbatten was not silent. He was, by several accounts, exultant. In the days immediately following the accession, Mountbatten told dinner guests, friends, and anyone who would listen that the House of Mountbatten now reigned. His nephew's wife was queen. The Mountbatten name, which his father, Prince Louis of Battenberg, had been forced to adopt during the anti-German panic of the First World War, and which Mountbatten himself had spent a lifetime rehabilitating through military distinction and imperial service, was now, in his triumphant interpretation, the name of the British royal house. He was not being subtle about it. He was being Dickie Mountbatten, which meant he was being grandiose, indiscreet, and strategically transparent all at once. He saw Philip's marriage as the culmination of a long game, and he wanted the world to know it. The world, or at least a part of the world that mattered in this context, reacted with something close to alarm. The horror was not purely snobbish, though snobbery was certainly present in the palace's corridors and drawing rooms. The horror was constitutional. If the House of Mountbatten now reigned, then the settlement George V had created in 1917, the settlement that had been defended through abdication, a world war, and the entire moral reconstruction of the monarchy under George VI, was effectively annulled. A single marriage had undone it. A man who had arrived as a foreign prince with no private fortune, and a name that was itself an anglicization of a German original, had, through his wife's succession, renamed the British royal house without anyone voting on it, debating it, or agreeing to it. Queen Mary, 84 years old and in the final year of her life, summoned her fury with the cold precision of a woman who had spent half a century defending the dynastic principle. She had been George V's wife. She had stood beside him when he created the House of Windsor. She had watched one son nearly destroy the settlement through abdication and another rebuild it through war. She was not about to watch it dissolved by Mountbatten presumption. Her intervention was direct and forceful. She communicated her opposition to the Prime Minister's office, to the palace household, and to anyone in her circle who might carry the message further. Queen Mary did not campaign. She pronounced. And her pronouncements, delivered from Marlborough House, in the measured tones of a woman who regarded the royal house as something approaching personal property, carried a weight that few living figures could match. The Queen Mother, still raw with grief, was equally resolute. Her husband had been a Windsor. He had died a Windsor. The monarchy he had rebuilt from the wreckage of abdication was Windsor to its moral foundations. She had spent 16 years as Queen Consort defending that inheritance, and the suggestion that it could be renamed within weeks of her husband's death. Renamed by the family of the son-in-law she had never entirely trusted, the son-in-law whose uncle was now boasting about dynastic conquest at London dinner tables, was intolerable. She made her feelings known. She did not need to make them known loudly. The Queen Mother's influence operated through intimacy rather than volume. A word to the right person, a silence in the right room, a gentle expression of concern to a daughter who was still learning the weight of the crown she wore, these were sufficient. Churchill agreed, and Churchill's agreement transformed the matter from a family disagreement into a constitutional settlement. The Prime Minister's position was not merely sentimental, though Churchill was sentimental about the monarchy in a way that bordered on the devotional. It was a matter of state. The name of the royal house was a public identity, woven into legislation, Commonwealth relationships, and the emotional fabric of national life. The cabinet was consulted. The Lord Chancellor offered his view. The consensus was swift, unanimous, and uncompromising. The house would remain Windsor. There would be no Mountbatten dynasty. Philip's name would not be elevated. The dead king's settlement would endure. Lascelles, from inside the palace, reinforced the same conclusion with the particular effectiveness of a man who controlled the administrative machinery through which the sovereign's decisions were formalized and communicated. He did not need to argue. He needed only to ensure that the right advice reached the Queen through the right channels at the right time, and that the alternative, the Mountbatten alternative, was never presented as a serious constitutional option. By the time the formal decision was made, there was nothing left to decide. The consensus had hardened around the Queen before Philip could mount a sustained counter-argument. Philip fought it. He fought it privately, within the channels available to a man whose constitutional position gave him proximity to the Queen, but no formal mechanism for influencing the advice she received. The details of his private arguments are not fully documented. The palace's internal conversations in early 1952 were not recorded for public consumption, and the discretion of the household staff was, in this period, still largely intact. But the shape of his resistance is clear from what biographers, associates, and later royal accounts reported. He argued that it was natural and customary for a wife to take her husband's name, and that the convention applied as much to a queen as to a shopkeeper's daughter. He argued that his children should bear his name, that the basic right of paternal identity was not something the state could strip from him simply because his wife held a constitutional office. He argued that no man in the country, from the humblest laborer to the most distinguished peer, was denied the right to pass his surname to his descendants, and that denying him that right reduced him to something less than a husband and father. He argued with logic, with passion, and with the particular fury of a man who had already given up everything that could be given up and was now being asked to give up the one thing he had thought was inalienable. The arguments were reasonable. They were, in the terms of ordinary family life, unanswerable. But this was not ordinary family life. This was the British monarchy in the aftermath of the most dangerous succession crisis in living memory. And in the British monarchy, the name of the house was not a domestic matter. It was a national settlement. Philip's logic, however sound, was overmatched by the combined weight of the Prime Minister, the Lord Chancellor, the Privy Council, the palace household, his mother-in-law, his wife's grandmother, and the ghost of a dead king whose legacy no one was prepared to see diminished. On the 9th of April, 1952, 2 months after her father's death, Elizabeth issued a declaration through the Privy Council. She and her descendants would be known as the House and Family of Windsor. The declaration was formal, public, and unambiguous. It settled the matter with the finality of constitutional law. It also delivered to Philip a defeat that was simultaneously political, constitutional, and intimate, a public statement endorsed by the Queen herself, that his name was not worthy of the dynasty he had married into, that his lineage, despite its royal pedigree stretching back centuries through the houses of Greece, Denmark, and Battenberg, carried less authority than the invented English surname his wife's grandfather had chosen during a moment of wartime panic 35 years earlier. Philip absorbed the blow. He did not make a public scene. He did not give an interview or issue a statement or break ranks in any way that the press could seize upon. But the bitterness was real and lasting, and it surfaced in private remarks that friends and associates would repeat for decades afterward. He told people he was the only man in the country not allowed to give his children his name. He described himself, in a phrase that has survived in multiple accounts, as little more than an amoeba, a single-celled organism whose sole biological function was reproduction without identity, contribution without legacy. There is something about that word amoeba that deserves to be sat with. Philip was not a man given to self-pity. He was proud, sharp-tongued, physically formidable, intellectually restless, and temperamentally allergic to weakness in any form. For him to reach for a metaphor of such complete self-erasure, not merely diminishment but biological anonymity, the reduction of a husband and father to a function without a name, suggests the depth of a wound that went far beyond political disappointment. This was not a man losing an argument about nomenclature. This was a man being told by the institution he had married into and the wife he loved that his identity did not matter enough to survive into the next generation. He had given up his nationality, his foreign titles, his naval career, his sister's presence at his wedding, his home, and his domestic autonomy. Now he had given up the one thing that might have connected him, through his children, to the future of the institution he served. He was present in the marriage. He was absent from the dynasty, and the woman who had done more than anyone to ensure that absence, the woman whose grief and whose authority and whose quiet, implacable influence had tipped the scales against him, was about to move into the house he had built. The move from Clarence House to Buckingham Palace, which happened in stages through the spring and early summer of 1952, completed the geography of loss. Clarence House had been Philip's project, the house he had modernized with his own eye for what worked and what did not, the house where his children had been born and taken their first steps, the house where the wiring functioned because he had made it function, and the rooms felt habitable because he had made them habitable. Buckingham Palace was something else entirely. It was the sovereign's official residence and working headquarters, 775 rooms, a staff of several hundred, corridors that seemed to go on forever, and a household administration that operated according to procedures laid down decades earlier and saw no reason to revise them simply because the new queen's husband had opinions about efficiency. Philip arrived in the palace as the queen's consort, which sounded elevated and was, in constitutional terms, entirely subordinate. There was no job description for what he was supposed to do. There was no precedent from which to build one. Prince Albert had carved out a role in the Victorian era, but that was a century ago, under a different kind of monarchy and a queen who had actively desired her husband's involvement in affairs of state. Elizabeth was constitutionally dutiful in a way that did not easily create space for a partner's initiative. She listened to her private secretaries. She read her boxes. She followed the advice of her ministers. The system around her was designed to serve the sovereign, not to accommodate the sovereign's husband and the people who ran that system, Lascelles chief among them, but the broader household too. Treated Philip with a formal courtesy that carried beneath its polish the unmistakable implication that he was a guest in a house that answered to someone else. The texture of that hostility was granular and cumulative rather than dramatic. Philip would later describe the experience, in remarks that biographers preserved, as being constantly squashed, snubbed, and ticked off. The language was characteristically blunt, but the experience it described was more insidious than bluntness could capture. It was in the scheduling, audiences and engagements arranged for the Queen without consulting Philip, decisions about the royal calendar communicated to him after they had already been made. It was in the architecture of access, the Queen's private apartments managed by staff who had served her father and who regarded Philip's presence in the working rooms of the palace as an intrusion rather than a right. It was in the small humiliations of precedence, being directed to sit in a particular place, being excluded from a particular meeting, being reminded through the elaborate protocols of court life that his position derived entirely from his wife's status and carried no independent authority whatsoever. Elizabeth was caught between them, and her position was more painful than any public account suggested. She loved Philip. She had chosen him against the reservations of her father, the skepticism of the court, and the subtle resistance of a mother who had never fully warmed to the match. She saw his frustration. She understood, at least in part, what it cost him to be brilliant and energetic and purposeful in a system that treated purpose as a form of impertinence. But she was also the queen. She had inherited a constitutional structure built by her father, maintained by her grandmother, reinforced by Churchill and Lascelles and the entire apparatus of the state, and she could not dismantle it simply because her husband was unhappy. The advice she received from every official quarter, from her private secretary, from the Prime Minister, from the Lord Chancellor, pointed in one direction: continuity. The name was Windsor. The court would operate as it had always operated. Philip would be given a role in due course, but the role would be defined by the institution, not by him. Whether Elizabeth agreed with all of this, or whether she was carried along by the weight of advice she had been trained since childhood to respect, is one of the questions this story cannot fully answer. What is visible is the pattern. In every major decision of the early reign, the naming question, the household structure, the move to Buckingham Palace, the court's operating procedures, and the outcome favored the old guard and diminished Philip. Elizabeth's signature was on the declarations. Her voice delivered the decisions. But the decisions themselves bore the fingerprints of the people who had surrounded her before Philip arrived and who intended to remain there after he had been put in his place. The Queen Mother's widowhood, meanwhile, was not the retreat that widowhood might have been for a lesser figure or a less determined one. In the weeks and months after George VI's death, she occupied a position of extraordinary emotional authority, one that no constitutional document defined, but that no one in the palace or the government could afford to ignore. She was the mother of the sovereign. She was the widow of the man who had saved the monarchy. She was the woman who had walked through the Blitz in her best hat and made stoicism look like grace. And she was a woman whose grief was genuinely devastating. She had lost not just a husband, but a partner in the most demanding joint enterprise in British public life. And the collapse of that partnership left her, at 51, without the role that had given her life its structure and its meaning. For a brief period, there were fears that the Queen Mother might withdraw entirely. She retreated to Scotland, to Birk Hall on the Balmoral estate, and the silence from her quarters alarmed those who depended on her presence. The fear was not purely sentimental. A grieving, invisible Queen Mother would be a waste of one of the monarchy's greatest assets: her warmth, her social skill, her ability to make people feel that the crown cared about them personally. Churchill wrote to her. Friends visited. And slowly, over the spring and summer of 1952, she reemerged, not as a diminished figure clinging to the edges of public life, but as a woman who had found a new form for her old authority. Clarence House was designated as her new London residence, along with Princess Margaret, who was 21 and unmarried and whose emotional volatility, her intensity, her wit, her capacity for both charm and fury made her a vivid presence in any household she inhabited. The decision to place them both at Clarence House made logistical sense. The Queen and her consort were at Buckingham Palace, and the house was available. But Philip felt the symbolism like a blade. The home he had built, the house whose wiring he had modernized, whose rooms he had arranged, whose nursery had held his infant children, was being handed to the woman who had helped ensure that his name would never appear on the dynasty he served. The Queen Mother would move in shortly before the coronation, and she would make it her own with a thoroughness that erased Philip's brief domestic tenure as completely as if it had never existed. She would remain at Clarence House for the rest of her life, nearly half a century, during which the house became the most famous private royal residence in London, synonymous not with Philip's modest post-war experiment in functional living, but with the Queen Mother's legendary hospitality, her gin and dubonnet, her corgi, her racing talk, her immovable, gracious, utterly formidable presence at the center of a court that existed outside the formal structures of the sovereign's household, but exerted an influence over them that no organogram could capture. But all of that was still ahead. In the spring of 1952, the immediate landscape was this. Elizabeth was queen, installed at Buckingham Palace, surrounded by courtiers who had served her father and who regarded her husband with varying degrees of suspicion, condescension, and institutional caution. Philip was consort, a role without a job description, a position without independent authority, a title that derived entirely from his wife's status and could be enhanced or diminished at the institution's pleasure. He had lost the naming fight. He was losing Clarence House. The court was hostile. His Uncle Dickie's indiscretions had made him radioactive by association. And his mother-in-law, for all her grief and all her genuine affection for Elizabeth, was consolidating a position from which she could ensure that the monarchy remained what her husband had made it, a Windsor institution, run by Windsor people on Windsor terms. On the 18th of September, 1952, the Queen issued a formal declaration granting Philip place, preeminence, and precedence next to her on all occasions except where otherwise provided by Act of Parliament. It sounded generous. It was, in constitutional terms, a significant honor. But it was also, in its own way, a confirmation of the problem. Philip's status had to be given to him by proclamation, because it did not arise naturally from the system. He was beside the sovereign by decree, not by right. The monarchy was granting him rank while withholding inheritance. It was saying, you may stand here, but you may not name what stands after you. And yet he was not finished. That is the detail the story requires here, because the easy narrative, the defeated husband, the sideline consort, the man crushed by the weight of the Windsor establishment, misses the part of Philip that never accepted defeat as permanent. He was wounded, he was bitter, he was for a period genuinely unhappy in a way that those closest to him could see, even when the public could not, but he was also a man who had survived a fractured childhood, the loss of both parents to absence and illness, a European war, and the systematic stripping of every identity he had ever carried, and he had survived all of it by finding a new lane when the old one closed. The naming fight was lost. Clarence House was about to be lost. The court was hostile. But the monarchy was about to stage the most ambitious public event in its modern history, the coronation of Elizabeth II. And the question of how that event would be presented to the British people and the watching world was still unresolved. It was a question that played directly to Philip's strengths. His instinct for modernity, his understanding of what mass media could do for an institution that feared it, and his belief that a monarchy that hid from its public would eventually be abandoned by it. The coronation was 18 months away, and Philip, for all that had been taken from him, intended to have a say in how it looked. The Coronation Commission was established in the spring of 1952, charged with planning every detail of the ceremony that would formally crown Elizabeth II at Westminster Abbey. It was, in organizational terms, a vast enterprise, a collaboration between the palace, The government, the Church of England, the armed forces, the Commonwealth, and the aristocratic households whose hereditary roles in coronation rituals stretched back centuries. The Earl Marshal, the Duke of Norfolk, held overall responsibility, as the Norfolks had done since the 17th century. The Archbishop of Canterbury would conduct the religious ceremony, the Prime Minister's office would manage the political and constitutional dimensions, and Philip, who held no hereditary role and no formal constitutional function in the proceedings, was appointed to the commission, a position that gave him a seat at the table without giving him authority over it. It was in many ways the perfect summary of his situation. He was present but not central. He was consulted but not commanding. He was married to the woman at the heart of the entire enterprise, and yet in the commission's hierarchy he ranked below the Earl Marshal, the Archbishop, and the Prime Minister. But Philip did not approach the commission as a man accepting his limitations. He approached it as a man who had identified the one fight he might actually win. The fight was over television. The question of whether the coronation should be broadcast on live television had been circulating in government and palace circles since the accession, and the positions had hardened quickly along predictable lines. The traditionalist, Churchill, Lascelles, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the senior court household were opposed. Their objections were partly practical. Television cameras were intrusive, the equipment of the early 1950s was bulky and unwieldy, and the intense lighting required for the cathode ray technology of the era would turn the solemn interior of Westminster Abbey into something resembling a film set. The cameras would need to be positioned on raised platforms. The cables would have to be run through a medieval building not designed for modern broadcasting infrastructure. The heat from the lighting rigs would be considerable, and the prospect of the Queen visibly perspiring during her own coronation was to the palace unacceptable, but the practical objections were in truth secondary. The deeper resistance was philosophical, and it ran to the heart of what the old guard believed monarchy was for. The coronation was a religious ceremony, the most sacred act in the constitutional calendar of the Church of England. It included the anointing of the sovereign with holy oil, a ritual whose origins were medieval and whose theology was mystical. The moment at which the monarch was, in the formal language of the church, consecrated and set apart. To broadcast that moment into pubs and front parlors and the flickering gray screens of a nation that was still, in 1952, learning what television was, and to make it available to any family with a set and a license fee, struck the traditionalist as a violation of something essential. The mystery of monarchy depended in their understanding on distance. You did not bring the sacred into the living room. You preserved it behind stone walls and closed doors, and the nation's relationship with its sovereign was deepened by what it could not see, not by what it could. Churchill put it in characteristically grandiloquent terms. He was not opposed to the modern world. He was opposed to the vulgarization of something that derived its power from its separateness. If you let the cameras in, you let the mystery out. And once the mystery was gone, it would not come back. Philip saw it differently. Philip saw it, in fact, with a clarity that the older men around him could not match, because he understood something about the post-war world that they did not, that deference was dying, and that a monarchy which relied on deference alone would die with it. Philip saw it differently. Philip saw it, in fact, almost exactly the opposite way. His argument, advanced within the commission, through his allies, and through every channel of influence available to a man married to the sovereign but excluded from her constitutional council, was that the coronation represented the single greatest opportunity the monarchy had to secure its relationship with the modern public. Television was not a threat to the institution. It was a delivery mechanism. Millions of people who would never stand in the streets of London or peer through the gates of Westminster Abbey could, through television, witness the moment their queen was crowned. They could see the pageantry, the solemnity, the beauty of the ritual. They could feel a part of it, and in feeling a part of it, they would be bound to the monarchy by a connection that no amount of newspaper coverage or radio commentary could replicate. The image was the thing. Philip understood that. He understood it because he was a man of the 20th century in a way that Churchill, who was 77 and whose instincts were formed in the Victorian and Edwardian eras, was not. The debate was not resolved quickly. Churchill's opposition was formidable. not merely as Prime Minister, but as the last surviving figure of genuine Victorian grandeur in British public life, a man whose rhetorical authority could make resistance to change sound like the defense of civilization itself. The Archbishop, Geoffrey Fisher, was equally resistant, particularly regarding the anointing. Lascelles, predictably, sided with restraint, and Elizabeth herself was by temperament and training more cautious than her husband. She did not relish the idea of performing the most intimate religious act of her life under the scrutiny of television cameras. The prospect of millions watching her face as holy oil was applied to her hands, her breast, and the crown of her head, the prospect of her expression being analyzed, reproduced, discussed, was not something she embraced with enthusiasm. But Philip pressed. He pressed through the commission, where his arguments found allies among the younger and more practically minded members who could see that the public mood was running strongly in favor of broadcasting. He pressed through Mike Parker, his equerry and closest confidant, who shared Philip's conviction that the monarchy needed to adapt or face a slow decline into irrelevance. He pressed through the younger members of the household, the private secretaries and equerries who would inherit the institution after the Lascelles generation retired and who understood, as their elders did not, that the country was changing. Rationing was ending. The welfare state was being built. A new generation was emerging that had been shaped by the war, but was not imprisoned by it. A generation that expected institutions to justify themselves rather than simply demand deference. Television was the medium of that generation. By 1952, there were already over 1.5 million television sets in Britain, and the number was growing rapidly. The coronation, Philip argued, was not merely a ceremony. It was an opportunity, perhaps the greatest a monarchy would ever have, to bind a new generation to the crown through the most powerful communication technology in history. He pressed, presumably, in the private hours of his marriage, too. Though what passed between Elizabeth and Philip behind closed doors on this subject, as on all subjects, remains their own. There were reports that Elizabeth was initially persuaded by the arguments against televising, and that she changed her mind over time. Influenced, biographers have suggested, by a combination of Philip's persistence, the shift in public opinion, and her own growing recognition that the coronation belonged to the nation as much as it belonged to her. What is known is the outcome. In the late autumn of 1952, the decision was confirmed. The coronation would be televised. The cameras would be admitted to Westminster Abbey. The ceremony would be broadcast live to the nation and through relay links and recorded transmissions to the Commonwealth and beyond. The sole exception was the anointing itself, which would remain unfilmed, a concession to the Archbishop's insistence on preserving the sacred core of the ritual from the public gaze. It was a compromise, but it was overwhelmingly Philip's kind of compromise. The modernizers won the war, while the traditionalists won a single, symbolic battle. It was Philip's first significant victory since the accession, and it was not a small one. The decision to televise would transform the coronation from a ceremony witnessed by 7,000 people inside Westminster Abbey into a shared national experience of unprecedented scale. On the day itself, the 2nd of June, 1953, 27 million viewers in Britain would watch the broadcast, the largest television audience the country had ever seen, far exceeding the number who listened on the radio. Families who had never owned a television set would crowd into the homes of neighbors who did. Pubs would install sets for the occasion. The BBC would deploy 21 cameras inside the Abbey and along the processional route. The broadcast would run for more than 7 hours, and for those 7 hours, the monarchy would be more visible, more accessible, and more intimately present in the lives of ordinary British people than at any moment in its 1,000-year history. Philip had made that possible. His instinct that the monarchy could be strengthened by being seen, not weakened, would prove to be one of the most consequential judgments of the 20th century crown. And it demonstrated to anyone paying close attention inside the palace that the man the old guard had tried to marginalize possessed a strategic understanding of the monarchy's relationship with its public that surpassed anything the guardians of tradition could offer. But it was a victory won inside a larger defeat, and Philip knew it. He had won the argument about how the coronation would be seen. He had not won the argument about what the coronation would mean. For the dynasty, For the name, for his place within the institution, the ceremony would still be a Windsor ceremony. He would still kneel before his wife and swear homage as a subject, not as an equal. The nation would watch him do it. And the woman who had helped ensure that the house remained Windsor, the woman whose grief and authority had tipped the scales against him, would watch from a position of honor in the abbey, her status as Queen Mother undiminished, her influence over Elizabeth unbroken, her claim on the emotional center of the dynasty as strong as it had ever been. The preparations for the coronation consumed the better part of a year, and during that year, the Queen Mother completed her migration into the territory Philip had built. She moved into Clarence House in the spring of 1953, shortly before the coronation, with Princess Margaret. The house that Philip had modernized, the house where he had installed working plumbing and functional heating, where he had arranged rooms with an eye toward utility and domestic comfort, where Charles had learned to walk and Anne had been carried from the hospital in a nurse's arms, became overnight someone else's home. The Queen Mother did not simply occupy the house. She remade it room by room, floor by floor, with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that a home is an argument about how life should be lived and who intended to win that argument completely. She brought her own furniture, her own paintings, her own decorative sensibility, a style that favored warmth over austerity, comfort over efficiency, the soft accumulation of beautiful objects over Philip's Spartan functionalism. She hung her collection of paintings by Augustus John, Walter Sickert, and other 20th century British artists. She filled rooms with flowers, massive, extravagant arrangements that became one of the visual signatures of her household. She installed her staff, her routines, and her particular rhythm of daily life. Morning correspondence, afternoon engagements, evening entertaining on a scale that made Clarence House one of the most active social centers in London. And then there was the room. The single most telling detail of the Queen Mother's transformation of Clarence House, the detail that carries the emotional weight of the entire documentary's argument, concerns one specific space. Philip had used a room on the ground floor as his study. It was his working space, his private operational domain within the household, the room where he had sat at a desk and planned the modernization of a house and, by extension, of the idea of royal domestic life. It was where he read naval papers, where he corresponded, where he exercised the kind of purposeful control that gave him a sense of usefulness during the years when usefulness was available to him. When the Queen Mother took possession of Clarence House, she converted that room into her morning room. Philip's desk was removed. His papers, his naval memorabilia, his working apparatus, all of it was cleared. In its place, the Queen Mother created a reception space of quiet elegance. Pale walls, comfortable seating, the floral arrangements that accompanied her everywhere, a room designed for receiving visitors, for intimate conversation, for the particular kind of social performance at which she was without equal. The study, the man's room, the working room, the room that had said this household has a husband who does things, became a room that said this household has a hostess who receives. There is something about that detail that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it operates on two levels simultaneously, and both of them matter. On one level, it is simply a practical matter, a widow renovating a new residence to suit her tastes, as any new occupant of any house would do. On another level, it is a territorial act of quite devastating completeness. The Queen Mother did not merely move into Philip's house. She erased the room that had been most distinctly his and replaced it with a room that was most distinctly hers. Whether she did this with conscious symbolic intent or simply with the instincts of a woman who had spent 30 years shaping domestic spaces to reflect her own vision of grace is a question that cannot be answered from outside the relationship. But the effect was the same either way. Philip's physical claim on Clarence House, the last tangible evidence that his vision of royal domestic life had once existed in those walls, was gone. The morning room was the Queen Mother's now. It would remain hers for nearly half a century, and visitors who sat on its sofas and admired its paintings and accepted its drinks would never know that the room had once held a desk where a young naval officer had tried to build a different kind of royal home. Margaret's presence in the household deepened its character and its gravitational pull. Princess Margaret was 22 by the time of the coronation, And she was everything that Elizabeth, in her sovereign restraint, was not: vivid, mercurial, glamorous, emotionally volatile, and possessed of a social magnetism that made her the most talked about young woman in London. She smoked from a long cigarette holder. She drank whiskey. She stayed out late at nightclubs and private parties in the kind of Mayfair gatherings where the post-war smart set mixed aristocratic titles with theatrical talent. She said things that made courtiers wince and debutantes swoon. She was witty in a way that her sister never attempted to be, sharp in a way that could cut, and beautiful in a way that photographers competed to capture. She was also, beneath the sparkle and the social performance, profoundly affected by her father's death and by the sudden, irreversible transformation of her sister from confidant into sovereign, a shift that altered the most important relationship of Margaret's life and left her stranded in a constitutional no man's land. Too royal to be ordinary, too junior to be important, too independent to be contained. At Clarence House with her mother, Margaret found a household that suited her temperament in ways that Buckingham Palace never could. The Queen Mother's court was warm, social, spontaneous, and ungoverned by the rigid scheduling and procedural formality that defined life around the sovereign. It was a place where laughter was permitted after 10 o'clock, where gin and Dubonnet was poured with the generosity of a hostess who believed that hospitality was a form of love, where the conversation ranged from horse racing to society gossip, to the gentle, persistent cultivation of relationships with the people who constituted the upper reaches of British public life. For Margaret, who craved intensity and intimacy and the feeling of being at the center of things, Clarence House offered something that her sister's palace could not: freedom from the relentless, suffocating propriety of the sovereign's household. There was also, in that spring and summer of 1953, a private drama forming around Margaret that would, within 2 years, become a national scandal. Her deepening attachment to Group Captain Peter Townsend, a divorced equerry of her father's who was 16 years her senior and whose marital status made any formal relationship with a princess constitutionally and ecclesiastically impossible. That story belongs to a later chapter, but its origins were here, at Clarence House, in the emotional atmosphere of a household shaped by loss, by the Queen Mother's particular blend of warmth and control, and by Margaret's restless search for someone who would pay her the kind of sustained, devoted attention that her father's death had taken from her. The Townsend affair would become, in time, another front in the broader war between royal convention and personal desire. But in the spring of 1953, it was still private, a current running beneath the surface of a household that presented itself to the world as a haven of widowed grace. The court that formed around the Queen Mother at Clarence House was not, in any formal sense, a rival to Buckingham Palace. It had no constitutional function. It issued no decrees. It conducted no state business. It did not appear in any organogram of the royal household, but its influence was real and pervasive, operating through the particular channels that the British establishment has always favored: social connection, personal loyalty, shared values, and the kind of informal authority that accrues to someone who is simultaneously beloved, respected, and irreplaceable. When the Queen Mother entertained at Clarence House, and she entertained constantly, with an apparently inexhaustible energy for company, her guests included cabinet ministers, bishops, senior military figures, racehorse trainers, the editors of sympathetic newspapers, and the aristocratic families whose loyalties and sympathies she had cultivated across 3 decades of royal life. She did not need to campaign against Philip. She did not need to whisper against him in any crude or conspiratorial fashion. She simply needed to be there, to be present, to be visible, to be the living embodiment of everything the old Windsor order valued and everything Philip's modernizing impulse implicitly challenged. And the message transmitted itself through every room she entered and every hand she held. Philip's path, by contrast, was outward. Having lost the naming fight and the domestic ground of Clarence House, he turned his energy toward the areas where the court could not easily contain him: public modernization, institutional reform, and the future-facing work of connecting the monarchy to a Britain that was changing faster than its rituals acknowledged. The television victory was the first expression of this strategy, but it would not be the last. Philip began, in the months surrounding the coronation, to develop ideas about how the palace's internal operations could be made more efficient, rationalizing staff structures, questioning procedures that existed only because they had always existed, challenging the assumption that tradition and effectiveness were the same thing. He pushed for the monarchy to engage more directly with industry, science, technology, and youth, the constituencies of the future, rather than the constituencies of the past. He conceived of what would eventually become the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, launched in 1956, a program designed to connect the crown with young people through achievement, service, physical challenge, and the kind of self-reliance that Gordonstone had drilled into Philip himself decades earlier. He was, in short, doing what he had always done, finding the work that needed doing and doing it, whether or not anyone had asked him to. But the court did not make it easy. The men around Elizabeth, Lascelles, and after Lascelles' retirement in 1953, his successor Michael Adain, who was equally devoted to constitutional propriety, if somewhat less personally hostile, governed the Queen's official life with a thoroughness that left Philip perpetually on the outside of the decisions that mattered most. Philip could modernize the margins. He could push for television. He could tour factories and make speeches about technology. But the central machinery of the monarchy, the audiences with the prime minister, the contents of the red boxes, the constitutional advice that shaped the Queen's decisions, it remained close to him. He was the Queen's husband. He was not the Queen's partner in governance. And the people who enforced that distinction did so not out of personal malice, though personal friction certainly existed, but out of a conviction that the sovereign's constitutional role must be protected from the influence of anyone whose loyalty might be divided between the crown and their own ambitions. There is something about those two trajectories, Philip's outward drive and the Queen Mother's inward gravity, that explains why the conflict never reached an open confrontation and never fully resolved. They were operating on different planes, in different registers, with different audiences. Philip was fighting for the monarchy's future. The Queen Mother was guarding its past. Philip's weapons were innovation, media, efficiency, and the restless energy of a man who could not bear to be useless. The Queen Mother's weapons were presence, memory, social connection, and the unassailable moral authority of a woman who had stood beside a dying king and never once flinched. Both believed they were serving the institution. Both were, in their own terms, right. And Elizabeth, caught between them, did what she would do for the entirety of her reign. She held the center. She listened to Philip when he made sense. She deferred to the old guard when the Constitution demanded it. She loved her mother and she loved her husband, and she never, in any public or recorded moment, chose one over the other in a way that settled the matter permanently. The public, meanwhile, saw almost none of this. The public saw a young queen preparing for her coronation, supported by a handsome husband and a beloved mother. The public saw Clarence House as a gracious dowager residence, not as a conquered territory. The public saw the television debate as a question of modernity versus tradition, not as a proxy war between a sidelined consort and the establishment that had sidelined him. The gap between the public image and the private reality, the gap that this story exists to illuminate, was already enormous, and it was maintained by the one quality that everyone in the royal family shared, regardless of which side they occupied: the ability to perform. Philip performed the role of devoted consort. The Queen Mother performed the role of gracious widow. Elizabeth performed the role of serene sovereign. And behind those performances, the struggle for the monarchy's soul continued in rooms that the cameras Philip had fought for would never be allowed to enter. The coronation was weeks away now. Westminster Abbey was being prepared with a meticulousness that reflected the scale of the event. Scaffolding erected along the ancient stone walls, temporary seating installed for the 7,000 guests who would witness the ceremony in person. The great theater of the Abbey interior transformed into a space that could accommodate both medieval ritual and 20th century broadcasting technology. Camera positions were being marked for the BBC's outside broadcast team, whose 5 cameras inside the Abbey would capture the ceremony from multiple angles. Lighting rigs were being tested. Sound engineers were plotting microphone placements so that the Archbishop's words would reach the television audience with the clarity and solemnity they demanded. The logistics were immense: 340 yards of blue carpet, 540 chairs for the choir, a gold state coach that would carry the Queen through streets lined with hundreds of thousands of spectators, regardless of weather. Rehearsals were held in the ballroom at Buckingham Palace, with bed sheets standing in for robes and gramophone records providing the music. The country was in a state of anticipation that bordered on euphoria. Bunting was being hung from lampposts across Britain. Street parties were being planned in working class neighborhoods from Bermondsey to Bridgeton. Commemorative mugs and plates and tins of biscuits were being produced by the millions, bearing the young queen's profile and the date that would mark the beginning of what the press was already calling the new Elizabethan age. A country still recovering from war and austerity wanted badly to believe that something beautiful was coming. And the coronation, with its pageantry, its youth, its promise of continuity and renewal, was the vessel for that belief. Inside the palace, the preparations carried a different weight. Philip had spent months on the commission, fighting for the modern coronation he believed in and winning the battle that mattered most. He had demonstrated that his instincts about the monarchy's future were more acute than those of the men who had spent their careers preserving its past. But the ceremony itself, the liturgy, the oaths, the anointing, the order of precedence, the physical choreography of who stood where and who knelt before whom, was not Philip's to design. It belonged to tradition, to the Earl Marshal, to the Archbishop, and to the accumulated weight of 900 years of English coronation practice. And within that practice, there was a moment that Philip could not avoid and could not reshape. The moment when he would approach the throne, kneel before his wife, place his hands between hers, and swear the oath of homage. He would promise to become her liege man of life and limb in earthly worship. He would touch the crown on her head. He would kiss her left cheek. And then he would step back, and the next peer in line would kneel and swear the same oath, because in the coronation's ancient logic, the Duke of Edinburgh was simply the first among the peers of the realm, the highest ranked subject in the kingdom, but a subject nonetheless. 27 million people would watch him do it. The cameras he had fought for would record it. The Queen Mother would watch from the royal gallery, dressed in her own crown and purple robes, her widowhood transformed by the ceremony into a kind of elevated witness, the mother of the sovereign, the keeper of the last reign's memory, the woman who had ensured that the name on the dynasty was still the name her husband had carried. Philip's modernization would be visible in the broadcast. His subordination would be visible in the ritual. And the question that the coronation would answer, or fail to answer, was whether a man could serve an institution that honored his labor while denying his identity, and whether that service would be enough to sustain a marriage, a role, and a sense of self that had been under siege since the day a king died quietly in his sleep at Sandringham, and the world his son-in-law had known came softly, irrevocably, to an end. Queen Mary died on the 24th of March, 1953, 10 weeks before the coronation. She was 85 years old. She had been failing for months, confined to Marlborough House, her London residence, attended by doctors and the small loyal household that had served her through 5 reigns. Before her death, she left instructions that her passing should not delay the coronation. It was a final act of dynastic discipline from a woman who had spent her entire adult life subordinating personal feeling to institutional necessity, and it was received by the palace and the government with the particular mixture of grief and relief that accompanies the death of someone whose authority was immense and whose departure simplifies a complicated situation. Queen Mary's death removed the oldest and most formidable guardian of the Windsor name from the stage. She had been George V's wife, the woman who had watched him create the House of Windsor, who had seen one son abandon it and another rebuild it, and who had intervened personally to ensure that her grandson-in-law's surname would not replace it. Her opposition to the Mountbatten claim had been absolute, and her authority in making that opposition felt had been second only to Churchill's. With her gone, the naming settlement she had helped enforce lost its most senior advocate, though by March 1953 the settlement was so thoroughly embedded in constitutional fact that no single death could undo it. The House was Windsor. The declaration had been made. The argument was over in every sense except the emotional one. And the emotional argument, as Philip was learning, was the one that never ended. The weeks between Queen Mary's death and the coronation were consumed by the final preparations for an event whose scale exceeded anything the monarchy had attempted in modern memory. The logistics alone was staggering. Westminster Abbey was being transformed from a working church into a ceremonial theater capable of seating 7,600 guests, while accommodating the BBC's broadcasting infrastructure, the Archbishop's liturgical requirements, the Earl Marshal's processional choreography, and the security demands of a ceremony that would bring the heads of state and representatives of every Commonwealth nation to a single building in central London. Carpenters worked through the nights, electricians tested lighting rigs, seamstresses at the Royal School of Needlework put the finishing stitches into the Queen's coronation gown, a dress of white satin embroidered with the floral emblems of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth in gold and silver thread, seed pearls, and crystals, designed by Norman Hartnell and worked on by a team of embroiderers for 8 months. The imperial state crown was cleaned, adjusted, and fitted. The coronation regalia, the orb, the scepters, the ampulla of anointing oil, was brought from the Jewel House at the Tower of London and prepared for use in ceremonies that stretched back, in form if not in unbroken practice, to the medieval coronation of English kings. Philip rehearsed his part. There was a specific choreography to the homage that required practice. The approach to the throne, the removal of the coronet, the kneeling, the placement of hands, the recitation of the oath, the touching of the crown, the kiss on the left cheek, the retreat. It was a sequence of movements governed by centuries of precedent, and it had to be executed precisely, without hesitation, without error, because the cameras Philip had fought for would be recording every step, and 27 million people would be watching for any sign that the Duke of Edinburgh did not perform his subordination with grace. He rehearsed it in the ballroom at Buckingham Palace along with the other principal participants, moving through the ceremony in approximation, without the regalia, without the robes, without the sacred music, in the way that actors walk through a blocking rehearsal before the set is dressed and the audience arrives. The Duchess of Norfolk stood in for the Queen during some rehearsals. Lengths of cloth approximated the weight and drag of the robes. Someone marked the positions on the floor with tape. The difference, of course, was that this was not a performance in any theatrical sense. It was a performance whose meaning was entirely, constitutionally, and personally real. When Philip knelt before the woman standing in for his wife in the ballroom, he was practicing an act of submission that carried the full weight of everything that had happened since his father-in-law died in his sleep at Sandringham 16 months earlier. He would kneel as a subject. He would rise as a subject. The cameras would ensure that the nation understood the distinction. And the oath he would speak, liege man of life and limb, faith and truth unto death, was not metaphorical. It was the language of feudal allegiance, adapted for constitutional modernity, but undiminished in its emotional force. He was going to swear in front of the largest audience in British history that he belonged to his wife, not beside her, to her. Elizabeth rehearsed, too, with the particular thoroughness of a woman who understood that the coronation was not merely a ceremony, but the foundational act of her sovereignty, the moment at which her authority would be consecrated by God and witnessed by the nation, the moment after which there could be no ambiguity about what she was and what she owed. She practiced wearing the crown. She practiced the weight of it. St. Edward's crown, the actual coronation crown, made of solid gold, set with 444 precious stones, weighed nearly 5 pounds, and Elizabeth wore it around Buckingham Palace in the weeks before the ceremony, so that her neck would be strong enough and her posture steady enough to bear it through the hours of ritual without faltering. She practiced walking in the coronation robes, whose train extended 21 feet behind her and required 6 maids of honor to manage. She studied the liturgy. She learned the responses. She prepared for the most public day of her life with the private discipline of someone who believed that duty, performed correctly, was its own kind of prayer. The night before the coronation, the 1st of June, rain fell across London. The crowds were already gathering along the processional route, families with blankets and flasks of tea camping on the pavements of the Mall, Whitehall, and the streets around Westminster Abbey, determined to secure positions from which they might catch a glimpse of the golden coach as it passed. Some had been there since the previous afternoon. Others arrived through the night, joining a growing encampment of bodies and flags and sodden bunting that stretched for miles through the center of the city. The mood was festive despite the weather. A collective determination to celebrate that seemed to intensify with each passing hour of cold and damp, as though the discomfort were itself a form of devotion. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere was different, quieter, more charged, governed by the particular tension of a household preparing for an event that had been rehearsed exhaustively but could not, in the moment of its execution, be rehearsed again. The Queen's dressers laid out the coronation gown in the state dressing room. Her ladies in waiting prepared the robes, the gloves, the jewelry. The hairdresser arrived before dawn. Elizabeth's makeup was minimal. She would later say she wanted to look like herself. But the preparation was meticulous, because the face the cameras captured would be the face the nation remembered. Philip dressed in the uniform of an admiral of the fleet, the highest naval rank, bestowed upon him by his wife, in a gesture that acknowledged his naval identity, even as the ceremony ahead would formally subsume it into the consort's subordination. The uniform was white and gold, heavy with braid and insignia, and it suited him. He looked by every account magnificent, tall, straight-backed, the uniform carrying the authority of a man who had earned his rank at sea before it was confirmed by royal favor. He also looked to those who knew him well enough to read the expression, beneath the bearing, like a man who had prepared himself for something that required endurance rather than joy. The children, Charles, 4 years old, and Anne, 2, would not attend the full ceremony. Charles would be brought to the Abbey to watch a portion of the service from the Royal Gallery, seated between the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret, small enough that a special platform had to be built so he could see over the gallery rail. Anne was judged too young and would remain at the palace. The domestic detail seems trivial against the scale of the day, but it carries its own emotional weight. The Queen was leaving her children behind to be crowned, and the person with whom those children would spend the day was not their father but their grandmother. Even on this day, the architecture of the family arranged itself around the Queen Mother's gravitational pull. The 2nd of June, 1953, dawned gray and wet. The rain had not stopped. The temperature hovered around 11 degrees. The clouds sat low over London, turning the city's stone facades into dull silver and making the reds and golds of the bunting and the flags seem almost defiant, color insisting on itself against a sky that offered none. The crowds along the route were enormous. Estimates would later place the number at over 3 million people lining the streets between Buckingham Palace and Westminster Abbey. And they were drenched, shivering, wrapped in macintoshes and newspaper, and utterly, vocally, unshakably jubilant. Britain in June 1953 was a country that still remembered the Blitz, still lived with rationing's recent memory, still carried the weight of an empire that was contracting and a global position that was diminishing, and the coronation of a young, beautiful, dutiful queen offered something that no economic statistic or geopolitical analysis could provide. The feeling that the country still meant something, that its tradition still held, that there was beauty and solemnity and continuity at the heart of national life. The rain did not diminish the mood. If anything, it deepened it. There was something very English about standing in the rain for hours to watch a queen go past, and the crowd seemed to understand that the discomfort was part of the ritual. The Gold State coach departed Buckingham Palace at 10:30 in the morning, drawn by 8 gray geldings, its gilded exterior gleaming even under the overcast sky. Elizabeth sat inside, wearing the George IV state diadem and the Parliament robe, her face visible through the glass windows, her expression composed and serious. Philip sat beside her. The coach moved slowly, necessarily slowly, given the weight and the horses and the dense heaving crowds on either side, and the journey to Westminster Abbey took approximately half an hour. Inside the coach, which was ornate but notoriously uncomfortable, with poor suspension and a tendency to sway, the couple sat in the particular silence of 2 people who are about to do something that will define the rest of their lives and who have already said everything that can be said about it. Westminster Abbey, when they arrived, was a blaze of controlled spectacle. The interior had been transformed. The 7,600 guests were seated in tiered galleries that rose along the nave and transepts, dressed in robes and uniforms and mourning dress and the furs and jewels of the aristocracy, the Commonwealth, and the diplomatic corps. The choir of the abbey and the choir of the chapel royal were assembled. The orchestra was in position. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, waited at the altar in his cope and mitre. The Earl Marshal's officials, in their tabards, stood at their stations. The television cameras, 5 of them inside the abbey, positioned on platforms that had been built to be as unobtrusive as possible, were already transmitting. Across Britain, 27 million people were watching. Another 11 million were listening on the radio. In homes, pubs, community halls, cinemas, and the homes of neighbors generous enough to share their sets, the nation was gathered around the gray-blue glow of the cathode ray tube, watching their queen walk into the abbey. The ceremony lasted nearly 3 hours. The liturgy followed the form prescribed by tradition and adapted by Fisher and his advisors for the particular circumstances of a queen regnant in the television age. Elizabeth entered the abbey in procession, preceded by the regalia borne on cushions by the great officer of state. She was presented to the congregation, north, south, east, west, and acclaimed with shouts of recognition. She took the coronation oath, promising to govern according to law, to execute justice with mercy, and to maintain the Protestant religion established by law. She signed the oath. And then the ceremony moved into its most ancient and most sacred passage. Elizabeth was divested of her crimson robe, her jewelry, and her diadem. She sat in King Edward's chair, the ancient coronation chair, built in 1296 to enclose the Stone of Scone, wearing a simple white linen garment. She was in that moment stripped of every symbol of rank and power, reduced to the human being beneath the title, the woman inside the institution. 4 knights of the Garter held a golden canopy above her, screening her from the cameras and from the congregation, and the archbishop anointed her with holy oil, on her hands, on her breast, on the crown of her head, using the same formula that had been used, with variations, at every English coronation since the medieval period. The oil had been specially prepared from a recipe that included orange flowers, roses, cinnamon, musk, and ambergris. The anointing was the sacred heart of the ceremony, the moment at which the theology of the Church of England held that the sovereign was consecrated by God, set apart from all other subjects, transformed from a mortal woman into an instrument of divine governance. The television audience could not see it. They saw the canopy, the stillness, the reverent hush of the abbey. They could feel the weight of what was happening even though the act itself was hidden. And that tension between the visible and the sacred, between the public spectacle and the private mystery, was precisely the tension Philip had understood when he argued for the cameras and the archbishop had argued against them. Both of them had been right. The coronation needed to be seen. The anointing needed to be shielded. And the combination of those 2 truths produced a broadcast of extraordinary emotional power. And then the crown, St. Edward's crown, 5 pounds of gold and gemstone, was lowered onto Elizabeth's head by the archbishop, while the congregation shouted a single, thunderous recognition. The trumpet sounded, the guns in the Tower of London fired, the bells of the abbey rang. And in that moment, whatever complexity lay beneath the pageantry, the naming dispute, the court politics, the mother-in-law, the sidelined husband, was subsumed by something larger and older than any of them. Elizabeth was queen. She had been queen since her father's death, constitutionally and legally. But now she was queen in the fullest, most ancient, most theatrically overwhelming sense the institution could provide. Then came the homage. And here, the documentary must slow down, because this is the moment where the private story and the public ritual intersect with a precision that is almost unbearable in its clarity. The homage followed the enthronement, the moment at which Elizabeth, now anointed, invested, and crowned, was lifted into the throne of state by the archbishop and the bishops, seated above the congregation as the supreme governor of the church and the head of state. She held the orb in her left hand and the scepter in her right. The crown sat on her head. She was 27 years old, and the entire abbey, peers, bishops, Commonwealth representatives, foreign dignitaries, television cameras, and the invisible millions watching from their living rooms waited for the first act of homage. Philip rose from his seat in the choir. He removed his coronet, the small jeweled circlet that marked his rank as a duke, and held it in his hand as he walked toward the throne. The distance from his seat to the foot of the throne was not great, than perhaps 30 feet, but it was the most symbolically charged walk of his life. He was not approaching his wife, he was approaching his sovereign. The liturgy did not distinguish between the two identities, and neither could he. He reached the throne. He knelt on both knees, his naval uniform gleaming in the abbey's augmented light, his posture erect even in submission, the muscle memory of a man who had spent his life standing at attention and who could not suppress the instinct even while performing its opposite. He placed his hands between hers, her hands, which were small and steady, holding his larger ones in the ancient gesture of feudal submission, the physical enactment of a bond that was simultaneously legal, constitutional, spiritual, and devastatingly personal. And he spoke the words, "I, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, do become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship, and faith and truth I will bear unto you, to live and die, against all manner of folks. So help me God." The words were medieval in origin and unaltered in their force. Liege man of life and limb, faith and truth unto death, against all manner of folks. It was not merely an oath of allegiance, it was an oath of total submission, the language of a man pledging his entire existence, his physical body, his loyalty unto death to another person. Philip had sworn many oaths in his life, oaths of service, oaths of naturalization, oaths of office, but none carried the weight of this one, because this one was sworn to the woman he loved, in the building where they had married 6 years earlier, in front of the largest audience in human history, and it confirmed in the most public and irrevocable manner possible that his identity was hers to command. He touched the crown on her head, the ancient gesture of recognition, the vassal's acknowledgement of the sovereign's authority made physical. He kissed her left cheek. The kiss was brief, formal, and yet, Somar, to those watching closely, to those who knew the story behind the ritual, it carried an intimacy that the liturgy could not entirely suppress. It was a husband kissing his wife. It was a subject kissing his queen. It was both of those things at once, and neither of them entirely. And then he stepped back. He replaced his coronet, he returned to his seat, and the Duke of Gloucester came forward to kneel and swear the same oath, and the Duke of Kent after him, and the senior peers of each degree after them. Because in the logic of the coronation, Philip was the first to swear but not the only one, and his distinction was one of precedence rather than of kind. He was the highest ranked subject in the realm. He was also in that moment indistinguishable in constitutional function from every other peer who knelt after him. The oath he had spoken was the same oath they all spoke. The submission was the same submission. The only difference was that Philip had meant something more by it, and the woman on the throne had felt something more by it, and neither of them could say so. The Queen Mother watched from the royal gallery. She wore the purple robe of state and a crown set with the Koh-i-Noor diamond, one of the largest cut diamonds in the world, a stone with its own contested imperial history, set into the crown that had been made for her own coronation in 1937. She had entered the abbey in her own procession, accompanied by her own attendants, and taken her place among the royal family with a bearing that combined grief, dignity, and the unmistakable composure of a woman who had spent 30 years performing in the public gaze and who could control her exterior with absolute precision, regardless of what moved beneath it. Little Charles sat beside her, fidgeting occasionally, leaning against her, asking questions in whispers that she answered with the practiced patience of a grandmother who understood that a 4-year-old's attention span was not designed for 3-hour ceremonies. She was not the queen. She was not the consort. She was something else entirely. The memory of the last reign, incarnate and visible, dressed in the formal regalia of a status that no longer existed constitutionally, but that no one in the abbey or in the country would have dared to question emotionally. She watched her daughter crowned. She watched her son-in-law kneel. And whatever she felt in that moment, pride, grief, vindication, The bittersweet satisfaction of a woman whose world had held against the forces that had tried to reshape it. She kept it behind the same mask of serene composure that every member of the family wore because that was what Windsors did. They endured, they performed, and they never let anyone see the cost. What the nation saw that day was magnificent. The images that survived through the golden coach in the rain, the queen in white satin and gold, the crown descending, the abbey aglow with light and color, and the accumulated grandeur of 900 years remain among the most iconic in British public life. The coronation was, by any measure, a triumph. It was also, in the terms of this story, a contradiction rendered in liturgy and broadcast to the world. Philip had won the television battle. His instinct that the monarchy could be strengthened by being seen had been vindicated beyond any reasonable doubt. The broadcast had created a bond between crown and country that would endure for decades. But the ceremony his cameras captured was the ceremony that formalizes subordination. The nation had watched him kneel. It had watched him swear obedience. It had seen the hierarchy of their marriage enacted as public ritual, and the image was now fixed in the national consciousness. Philip behind, Elizabeth ahead. Philip kneeling, Elizabeth crowned. Philip useful, Elizabeth sovereign. The hours after the coronation passed in a blur of processions, balcony appearances, state banquets, and the accumulated social obligations of the greatest public event in modern British history. The return procession from the Abbey to Buckingham Palace took a deliberately circuitous route through the streets of London, down Whitehall, through Trafalgar Square, along Pall Mall, up St. James's Street, through Piccadilly, Hyde Park Corner, Marble Arch, Oxford Street, Regent Street, and back down the Mall, so that as many of the 3 million spectators as possible could see the golden coach carrying their crowned queen. The rain continued intermittently. The crowds were undimmed. The roar that greeted the coach at each turn of the route was the sound of a nation expressing something it could not have articulated in words: relief, pride, affection, the need to believe that tradition still held, and that the future could be trusted to a young woman in a golden crown. The royal family appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace 6 times that afternoon and evening, responding to the vast crowd that filled the mall from the Victoria Memorial to Admiralty Arch. Elizabeth, still wearing the imperial state crown and the purple robe of state, waved with the restrained economy of gesture that would become her signature. Philip stood beside her. To her left, slightly behind, in the position he would occupy on 10,000 future balcony appearances, the Queen Mother stood nearby, waving with the warmer, more personal style that the crowd adored. The open-palmed wave, the visible smile, the unmistakable impression that she was greeting friends rather than subjects. Little Charles, still in his white shirt and dark shorts, peered over the balcony rail with the uncomprehending fascination of a 4-year-old watching something too large to understand but too exciting to ignore. The family presented itself as a tableau of unity, and in the euphoria of the day, the presentation was accepted entirely at face value. That evening, the lights of London were on for the first time since the Blitz blackout restrictions had been lifted. The mall was illuminated. Fireworks were launched from the Thames. Street parties continued in every borough. The BBC's broadcast, which had run from 10:30 in the morning until 5:30 in the afternoon, was replayed in the evening for those who had missed it. The nation went to bed that night having participated in something communal, something that felt like a renewal, and the word most commonly used in the following day's newspapers was splendor. Inside the palace, after the guests had departed and the staterooms had been cleared, and the ceremonial robes had been hung, and the crown had been returned to its case, the reality was quieter and more ambiguous. There were no dramatic confrontations that evening. There were no arguments, no scenes, no breaking points of the kind that generate newspaper headlines or biographical revelations. The coronation had not created a crisis. It had confirmed one. The hierarchy was clear. The Queen Mother's position was clear. Philip's place was clear. He was the Queen's husband. He was the first to kneel. He was the man who had brought television into the Abbey and changed the monarchy's relationship with its public forever. He was also the man whose name did not appear on the house, whose former home now belonged to his mother-in-law, and whose strategic future depended entirely on his ability to make himself so relentlessly, visibly, undeniably useful that the institution could not afford to keep him at arm's length. That was the shift that the coronation produced, not a rupture, but a recalibration. Philip did not emerge from the 2nd of June 1953, defeated in the way he had been defeated by the Windsor Declaration. He emerged with something more complicated and in the long run more powerful: a method. Open rebellion was impossible. He was not going to storm out of Buckingham Palace, give an interview to the Daily Express, or mount a public campaign for the House of Mountbatten. Dynastic victory was foreclosed. The naming battle was lost permanently, or at least for as long as the settlement's defenders lived and governed. But usefulness, relentless, strategic, publicly visible usefulness, was a weapon that the old guard could not easily neutralize because the monarchy genuinely needed it. The institution needed someone to tour the Commonwealth, to visit factories and shipyards and scientific laboratories, to champion industry and innovation and youth, to connect the crown with the parts of modern British life that the aging court establishment could neither understand nor reach. Philip could do all of that. He had the energy, the intelligence, the physical stamina, and the temperamental impatience with stagnation that made him ideally suited to the work that needed doing. All he required was time. Time to build a record so extensive and so valuable that his contribution to the monarchy would become inseparable from the monarchy's own survival. The Queen Mother had won the early battles. She had kept the Windsor name. She had taken Clarence House. She had maintained her influence over Elizabeth and her centrality to the dynasty's emotional identity. Her court was established. Her authority was intact. Her grief had been transmuted into a new kind of power that would sustain her through decades of public life. But Philip was 32 years old on the day of the coronation, and the Queen Mother was 52. He had the one advantage that no amount of social grace or emotional authority or institutional support could match. He would still be there, still working, still pushing, still making himself indispensable, long after the world she was defending had ceased to exist. The question the coronation left unanswered was not whether Philip could defeat the old order. He could not. It was whether he could outlast it, whether patience, endurance, and the slow accumulation of usefulness could accomplish what confrontation never would. The years after the coronation moved fast, and they moved in the direction Philip had predicted. The monarchy that emerged from the 2nd of June, 1953, was not the same institution that had entered it. The television broadcast had demonstrated, with an immediacy that no internal memo or courtier's argument could match, that the crown's power lay not in distance, but in connection. The 27 million viewers had not been alienated by what they saw. They had been bound by it. The pageantry had not been diminished by proximity. It had been amplified. And Philip, who had fought for that broadcast against the opposition of the Prime Minister, the Archbishop, and the palace's own household, had been proved right in a way that could not be undone or forgotten. He used the capital wisely. In the months and years that followed the coronation, Philip built the role that no one had designed for him. Not by demanding it, but by doing it, day after day, appearance after appearance, tour after tour, speech after speech, until the accumulated weight of his contribution made the role's absence from the constitutional framework seem like an oversight rather than a principle. He chaired committees. He streamlined palace administration where the household allowed it, rationalizing staff procedures, questioning the necessity of rituals that existed only because they had always existed, introducing efficiencies that the old guard resisted and that the institution quietly adopted. He brought his naval instinct for operational clarity to a household that had been run on habit and hierarchy, and while his reforms were modest compared to his ambitions, they established a pattern that would be extended over the decades. He toured the Commonwealth extensively. The most dramatic early example was the 5-month solo voyage aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia in 1956 and 1957, a journey that took him through the Pacific, the Antarctic, Australia, New Zealand, and the South Atlantic, more than 40,000 miles in total, visiting territories and dependencies where the Queen could not easily travel and where the Crown's relationship with local populations required personal attention. The tour was grueling, politically sensitive, and domestically controversial. There were rumors, never substantiated but persistent in the press, that the extended separation reflected strain in the marriage, and Philip handled it with the stamina and directness that would become his public trademark. He made speeches, he inspected facilities, he opened buildings, shook hands, attended banquets, and performed the relentless ceremonial work that kept the Commonwealth's emotional connection to the crown from atrophying. He also, on the voyage's final leg, grew a beard, which Elizabeth reportedly told him to shave off before he came home. He did. He launched the Duke of Edinburgh's Award in 1956, a program designed to engage young people through a framework of voluntary service, physical recreation, skill development, and expedition. The ethos of Gordonstoun translated into a national and eventually global institution. The award would become one of Philip's most enduring legacies, eventually operating in more than 140 countries and engaging millions of young people in an experience that connected the crown to a generation for whom titles and precedence meant nothing but challenge and achievement meant a great deal. He championed British science and industry with genuine intellectual curiosity, visiting factories, laboratories, and engineering firms with the eye of a man who understood machinery and who found in the practical work of making things a satisfaction that the ceremonial work of monarchy could not provide. He became patron, president, or member of more than 780 organizations over the course of his career, and he brought to each one a directness and an impatience with waffle that made his involvement, however brief, memorable. He was not easy to work with and not always easy to like. He was blunt to the point of rudeness, impatient with incompetence, and capable of remarks about foreigners, women, and indigenous people that ranged from the awkward to the offensive. His public gaffes became a running feature of tabloid coverage, and his attitude toward the press oscillated between contempt and hostility. But he was also, by the testimony of those who worked closely with him over decades, a man of unexpected kindness, sharp intelligence, and genuine curiosity, a man who read widely, painted watercolors, was deeply engaged with environmental conservation long before it was fashionable, and who possessed in private a dry and self-deprecating wit that the public rarely saw. The marriage survived. It did more than survive. It endured, and it deepened in ways that no one in 1952 would have confidently predicted. The early years had tested it to its limits. Philip's bitterness about the naming defeat, the court's institutional hostility, the Queen Mother's quiet but relentless influence, and the fundamental asymmetry of a marriage in which one partner was sovereign and the other was constitutionally nothing. All of it had strained the bond that Kenya and Malta and Clarence House had forged. There were difficult periods. The long separations imposed by Philip's Commonwealth tours, particularly the 5-month Britannia voyage, generated press speculation about the state of the marriage that was painful to both of them and impossible to address publicly. Philip's friendships with other women, never proven to have been anything more than friendships, but persistent enough as rumor to become a feature of his biographical record, added a layer of tabloid scrutiny that he resented, and Elizabeth endured with the silence that was her default response to anything she could not control. But they found over the decades a working arrangement that accommodated both their natures. Elizabeth valued Philip's honesty, his willingness to tell her things that courtiers would not, to challenge her assumptions, to treat her as a person rather than in an institution. Philip valued Elizabeth's steadiness, her refusal to be swayed by fashion, her loyalty to the people she trusted, her capacity for a kind of love that was expressed not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, daily fact of presence. They had 2 more children, Andrew in 1960 and Edward in 1964. And the spacing of those births, years after the coronation's immediate turbulence, suggested that the marriage had reached a new equilibrium. They were not a demonstrative couple. They did not hold hands in public or exchange visible affections. But those who observed them closely over the decades, staff, family, visiting dignitaries, reported a partnership of deep mutual respect, shared humor, and the particular intimacy of 2 people who had weathered something together that no one else could fully understand. And then, in 1960, the naming question returned, not as a reopening of the war, but as a carefully negotiated armistice, 7 years in the making. On the 8th of February, Elizabeth issued a further declaration in council, It stated that while the royal house would continue to be known as the House of Windsor, those of her descendants who were not styled as Royal Highness and who required a surname would bear the name Mountbatten Windsor. The declaration was precise in its scope, limited in its application, and characteristically British in its ability to change something while appearing to change nothing. It did not rename the house. It did not create a house of Mountbatten Windsor. It acknowledged Philip's surname in the narrowest possible way, applicable to specific descendants in specific circumstances for specific legal purposes, while leaving the Windsor settlement fundamentally intact. It was, in the most British sense imaginable, a compromise. Philip did not get what he had wanted in 1952. He did not get the House of Mountbatten. He did not get the full integration of his name into the dynasty's identity. What he got was a hyphen, Mountbatten Windsor, applied to a subset of his descendants in circumstances where the full apparatus of royal styling did not apply. It was an acknowledgement without a concession, a gesture without a surrender. Philip, who had called himself an amoeba 8 years earlier, accepted it. Whether he accepted it with satisfaction or with the pragmatic resignation of a man who had learned to take what was offered is a question the public record does not fully answer. What he said privately was that he regarded the declaration as a recognition, however partial, however hedged, of his place in the family that bore his wife's name, but not his own. The Queen Mother, meanwhile, continued. She continued at Clarence House, and her continuation was itself a kind of triumph, a demonstration that widowhood, in the right hands, could be a second career rather than a diminishment. She was not merely surviving, she was flourishing. She became, over the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, the most consistently popular member of the royal family, beloved with a warmth and a personal affection that the Queen herself, admired, respected, revered, could not quite inspire. People loved the Queen Mother because she seemed to love them back. Her smile was famous, her wave was famous, her hats were famous, her fondness for racing. She owned and raced horses on the flat and over jumps, and her attendance at Cheltenham, Ascot, and Sandown was as reliable as the seasons, endeared her to a sporting public that might otherwise have regarded the monarchy as remote. She entertained at Clarence House with a regularity and a generosity that made the house the most vibrant private royal residence in London. Her luncheons and dinners were legendary, not for their extravagance, though the food was excellent and the wine was plentiful, but for the quality of the company and the warmth of the hostess. She collected people the way she collected paintings, with taste, discrimination, and an unerring instinct for those who would add something to the room. Politicians, bishops, generals, jockeys, comedians, writers. The guest lists at Clarence House reflected a range of acquaintance that no other member of the royal family could match. She bought the Castle of May on the north coast of Caithness in 1952, the most remote castle on the British mainland, and restored it over the following years as a private retreat where she could fish, garden, entertain small groups of friends, and enjoy the windswept solitude of the Pentland Firth. She outlived most of her contemporaries and all of her adversaries. She outlived Churchill, who died in 1965. She outlived Lascelles, who retired in 53 and died in 81. She outlived Mountbatten, whose assassination shook the family in 79. She outlived the entire generation that had closed ranks around her in 1952. And she did so without ever publicly acknowledging that there had been a war to close ranks about. Her version of events, to the extent that she ever offered one, was the version of a devoted mother and widow who had simply done her duty. The struggle with Philip was not denied. It was simply never spoken of in terms that admitted its severity. She maintained to the end the serene surface that had been her greatest asset since the Blitz. And at Clarence House, in the morning room that had once been Philip's study, she received guests and poured drinks and talked about horses and smiled the smile that the nation adored. And the room's history was buried under decades of her habitation as completely as if it had never existed. Philip outlived them too. Most of them in the end. He outlived Mountbatten, who was assassinated by the IRA in August 1979, a death that removed the last of the Mountbatten generation's grand strategists and that devastated Philip in ways he did not publicly express. He outlived his own controversial reputation, watching as the blunt remarks that had seemed offensive in the 1970s and 80s were gradually reframed by a more forgiving public as the eccentricities of a man from another era. He outlived, most importantly, the institutional resistance that had defined his early years. The courtiers who had sidelined him retired or died. The constitutional settlement that had excluded his name softened incrementally over the decades. And the monarchy he had fought to modernize, the monarchy of television, of public engagement, of visible connection with the lives of ordinary people, became the monarchy that survived into the 21st century, while the closed, distant, ritually obsessed institution the old guard had defended receded into historical memory. The story of Philip and the Queen Mother was dramatized with significant artistic license by Netflix in the series The Crown. The first season, released in November 2016, covered the period from Elizabeth's wedding to the Suez Crisis of 1956, with Claire Foy as Elizabeth, Matt Smith as Philip, and Victoria Hamilton as the Queen Mother. The series treated the naming dispute, the Clarence House transfer, the Coronation television debate, and the broader tension between Philip and the palace establishment as central dramatic material, compressing timelines, heightening confrontations, and assigning interior motives with a confidence that the historical record does not always support. Matt Smith's Philip was charismatic, frustrated, and sympathetically drawn, a man whose energy and intelligence were visibly wasted by the constraints of his position. Victoria Hamilton's Queen Mother was formidable, politically acute, and more openly antagonistic toward Philip than the documented record warrants, a characterization that served dramatic purposes but flattened the ambiguity that made the real woman so difficult to reduce to a single interpretation. John Lithgow's Churchill was magisterial and sentimental, capturing the Prime Minister's attachment to the crown without fully rendering his constitutional pragmatism. The series was watched by tens of millions of viewers worldwide, won Golden Globes and Emmy Awards, and its portrayal of the early reign became, for an entire generation, the primary lens through which they understood the dynamics of Elizabeth's court. Subsequent seasons continued to explore the royal family's private tensions, with Olivia Colman and later Imelda Staunton taking over the role of Elizabeth and Jonathan Pryce playing Philip in the final seasons. History Extra and other fact-checking outlets ran detailed analyses of each season, noting where the series adhered to the historical record and where it departed. A public conversation about the boundary between drama and truth that was itself a form of cultural afterlife. A proof that the family story retained its hold on the public imagination long after the events themselves had passed into history. What The Crown captured, and what makes it useful rather than merely entertaining as a reference point, was the structural truth beneath the dramatized surface, that Philip's arrival in the royal family represented a genuine challenge to the Windsor order, and that the forces aligned against him were not villains, but custodians of a system built, at great cost, to survive. What the series simplified was the texture of the resistance. In The Crown, the Queen Mother's opposition is rendered as a series of discreet confrontations, drawing room arguments, pointed remarks, strategic maneuvers. In reality, the opposition was more diffuse, more atmospheric, and more devastating precisely because it did not announce itself. It was not a war conducted in set-piece battles. It was a climate, pervasive, constant, and inescapable. The Queen Mother died on the 30th of March, 2002 at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, 7 weeks after the death of her younger daughter Margaret, who had died on the 9th of February at the age of 71 after years of declining health. The loss of both her sister and her mother within weeks devastated Elizabeth in ways the public could sense, but the Queen herself would never articulate. The Queen Mother was 101 years old. She had outlived her husband by exactly 50 years and 2 months. She had occupied Clarence House for 49 years, longer than any other resident in the house's 2-century history. Her death was marked by a period of national mourning, a lying in state at Westminster Hall attended by more than 200,000 people who queued for hours to file past her coffin, and a funeral at Westminster Abbey that drew a congregation of 2,000 and a television audience of millions. She was buried beside George VI in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Her coffin was draped in her personal standard, A wreath of white camellias rested on top, and the Koh-i-Noor diamond, which had been set into her crown for the 1937 coronation, and which had sat atop the crown at her lying in state, accompanied her to the last. Philip was 80 years old when the Queen Mother died. He had spent exactly 50 years navigating the system she had helped define, defend, and sustain. He continued to serve. He continued to tour, to speak, to champion causes, to modernize where the institution permitted, and to endure where it did not. He was, by his 80th birthday, the most recognizable consort in the history of the British monarchy, a figure whose public image had evolved over the decades from controversial outsider to national institution. He retired from public duties in August 2017 at the age of 96, having completed more than 22,000 solo engagements over a career spanning 65 years. He was, by any statistical measure, the hardest working consort the monarchy had ever seen. He had not won the dynastic war. He had done something more interesting and perhaps more valuable. He had made himself indispensable to an institution that had once tried to make him irrelevant. He died on the 9th of April, 2021, at Windsor Castle, 2 months short of his 100th birthday. Elizabeth was at his side. The date carried its own quiet, devastating symmetry. The 9th of April was the anniversary of the 1952 Windsor Declaration, the Privy Council decree that had erased his name from the dynasty and provoked the bitterest wound of his early marriage. He died on the day that had defined his greatest defeat, having spent 69 years turning that defeat into something that looked from the outside like a life of extraordinary public service, and from the inside like a compromise that never fully healed. His funeral, held at St. George's Chapel on the 17th of April, was a small, pandemic-restricted ceremony attended by only 30 mourners. Elizabeth sat alone in her pew, masked, diminished, a widow at 95, separated from her husband's coffin by the protocol of a disease neither of them could have imagined. The image was the last great photograph of the Elizabethan age, a queen alone in the chapel where her family was buried, saying goodbye to the man who had walked behind her for 73 years. Elizabeth survived him by 17 months. She died on the 8th of September, 2022, at Balmoral Castle, at the age of 96. Her reign had lasted 70 years and 214 days, the longest in British history, longer than Victoria's, longer than any European monarch's. She was succeeded by her eldest son, who became King Charles III and who took up residence as his primary London home at Clarence House. The house his father had renovated in 1948, that his grandmother had claimed in 1953, and that now passed with all its layered history to the next generation. The house remains Windsor. The royal family's official website states it plainly. The family name is Windsor. The surname Mountbatten Windsor applies to those descendants of Elizabeth and Philip who are not styled as Royal Highness and who require a surname for legal purposes. The hyphen endures, Philip's partial vindication, the monarchy's partial concession, a British compromise made permanent in the language of birth certificates and marriage registers. Clarence House still stands on the Mall, adjacent to St. James's Palace, still open to visitors during the summer months, still decorated substantially in the style the Queen Mother established during her half-century of residence. The paintings she collected still hang on the walls. The morning room is still there, still elegant, still warm, still a reception space designed for hospitality rather than work. Visitors admire it, they photograph it. They read the guidebook description and note the Queen Mother's decorative taste. They do not know that the room once held a desk, and that a young naval officer once sat at that desk and planned the modernization of a royal household, and that the desk was removed to make way for a sofa when the officer's mother-in-law moved in and made the room her own. The cleanest thesis for this story is not that Philip was right and the Queen Mother was wrong, or that she was the villain and he was the victim, or that either of them failed. It is that Britain's post-war monarchy was trying to survive two contradictory truths at once. It needed to remain recognizably Windsor, because that name had become a national shelter, a word that meant endurance, continuity, and the particular English genius for appearing unchanged while changing just enough to endure. And it needed a consort like Philip, because the old form without adaptation would eventually harden into irrelevance and crumble. The cost of holding those two truths together was borne privately, inside a marriage that lasted 73 years, inside a mother-daughter bond that never publicly fractured, inside a house on the mall whose rooms changed hands and meanings, and whose morning room still holds in its quiet elegance the ghost of a desk that is no longer there.